Well, hello there, buttholes. It looks like it is time to be drug kicking and screaming through another episode of Have You Read This? Your host, Jason Morrison, who is the self-appointed authority on all things written, has no doubt prepared another 15 minutes of earhole torture. Buckle up for more of his rambling, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Episode number 26. I guess I should have celebrated episode 25, but I don't know. Is that even a milestone worth talking about? How many millions of people have a podcast and 25 episodes? I don't know. Does anybody even really care? Maybe episode 50, maybe that'll be the time for some celebration. Who knows? I've been asked a lot about what type of books I enjoy reading the most. And if I'm being honest, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure sometimes how to best answer that, how to categorize it, because I think honestly, that really depends on who's asking me the question. If it's someone who might be reading 4 or 5 books a year and they only know whatever author is popular enough to make it at the end caps at Target, then I guess my answer is I'll just say something like, well, I like psychological thrillers. If you're one of these people that only reads 4 or 5 books a year and you go get them at Target, I'm not coming at you. I'm just glad you're reading. Doesn't matter where you get your books or who you're reading. Anyway, if it's someone who does read a lot, I think that's where I find it tricky to kind of lump what I enjoy into like a single genre. What happens normally is I just say, well, I like reading dark and disturbing books. But what does that really mean though? Because I think that could be very subjective. What disturbs you might seem like just a regular thriller or horror novel to me, and what disturbs me might put you in therapy. I've mentioned this a few times in other episodes where I looked up a list of the most disturbing books ever written and planned to read as many of them as I possibly could. One of the first books to get under my skin a little bit was The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski. I ended up eventually also reading Splatterpunk, as well as books like Tampa by Alyssa Nutting and The Groomer. And I think some people would even label Saving Noah by Lucinda Berry as being dark and disturbing. I categorize dark and disturbing books pretty much into 3 separate categories. The first is just graphic content. Is the thing dark and disturbing solely because of the language and the descriptions of what's happening? And if you go back and listen to the episode that I did where I talk about Splatterpunk, I talk at length about books like this, including one where a whole chapter was dedicated to someone being waterboarded with diarrhea. So any extreme horror or graphic book would be dark and disturbing, and I think that should probably go without saying. When I first read The Painted Bird, I got to admit, I was pretty shocked. I don't think at the time I had read anything like that at all, and I don't know. I don't know if I've read anything like that since. But I'd not really dipped my toe into those waters just yet. So it was brand new to me. And that book is one of those that I think carries just about every kind of trigger warning that you might think of. And it wasn't a bad book by any stretch. I oftentimes recommend it to others solely because I think a lot of people don't know about it. It doesn't pop up on a lot of radars. I don't see it shared a lot on Facebook. And if you're curious about that one, I did an entire episode on it a while back. I think you got to go back to close to the beginning. This might be episode 3, somewhere in there. But that whole path eventually led me to read Cows by Matthew Stokoe, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. That one is often labeled as one of the most graphic and disturbing books ever written. And this might come as a total shock, but it's not about a happy farm. Oh no. The synopsis in part reads, Cows is a violent, blood-soaked nightmare, a scatological tale of love, self-empowerment, and probably the most extreme novel you'll ever read. When I was reading that, my brain kind of paused on scatological, and it's just a miracle I'm even able to pronounce that word right here. Fun word, right? And if you're slow like me, you might think you know what that means, but you want to Google it in the hopes that it doesn't mean what you think it means. And unfortunately, it means what you think it means. It's an interest in excrement. Yeah, cows. And when I think dark and disturbing as it relates to extreme graphic content, cows sits on the top of that list. Now, I've been told that Hog and I think that's spelled with 2 G's by Samuel Delaney. I've been told that one's worse than cows. And I just don't know if I want to test that theory or not. Cows was enough. I will say that Cows at least has an attempt at an original plot. Some of these extreme horror books I've read, there's very, very, very little plot and even less character development. It's just graphic details for the sake of graphic details. And if you pulled out all of those graphic details, all you would have left is probably a pamphlet. So Cows was really difficult to get through, but I at least found it highly unique. And if I were to recommend a graphically disturbing book with a different storyline that was capable of pushing someone over the edge, then this would be the one that I would suggest. The second category for how I would label dark and disturbing books, again, for me personally, would be novels that have emotional or psychological heaviness to them. I'm sure there's probably a better way to phrase that, but when your brain has limited capacity like mine does, this is the best you're going to get. Here, I think, is where novels like Saving Noah and Tampa might fit in. Although some feel that Tampa, because it's so graphic, that it's kind of in its own category altogether. I think even Lolita might work here. The novel that stands out the most for me here is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This story follows Vanessa, who is 15 years old and groomed by her 42-year-old teacher, Jacob Strain. The story is told through past and present and outlines or documents how she processes what Strain did to her. There are obvious reasons as to why this would be heavy emotional material. A teacher grooming and abusing a student, yeah, that's going to be a difficult read. However, the real weight of this story comes from, I think, you're basically watching the destruction of a human being. This one just takes you to dark places and it leaves you there to be uncomfortable. I thought it was beautifully written. I thought it was extremely powerful. And I did a deep dive into this one back in episode 12. So if you haven't read My Dark Vanessa and you're looking for a dark read, maybe something that's not overly graphic in detail like Cows or something that would fall into the splatterpunk genre, but you want something that is going to crush you emotionally and leave you empty, My Dark Vanessa would be the one that I would recommend. Finally, the third category that I lump dark and disturbing books into are kind of the all of the above type things. They are the ones that have graphic details, and they also will reach into your soul and yank out your emotions and set them on fire in front of you. I found the book Notice by Heather Lewis through Oliver Clark's YouTube channel. And there were two videos in particular that piqued my interest of his. Actually, I like his channel in general. He's a good dude. I'll link this stuff on the website so you can watch those yourself. But I found a review that he did of Cows, and the video was actually titled "The Least Disturbing Book I Have Ever Read." And I thought that was pretty interesting, given that the book I thought was challenging for me to read. And I think if you go back and you watch that, you'll see what he means by the least disturbing book. But I also found another video of his titled The Most Disturbing Book I Have Ever Read, Notice by Heather Lewis. And that video was actually recorded before he read Cows. And I didn't pay any attention to the dates he released these and thought he read Cows first and then Notice. Regardless, Cows was messed up. And if he didn't find that disturbing, then just how bad was Notice, right? I will link, like I said, to his channel and the videos that he put out, because I think he did a really good job explaining what he means about cows. And he also did a really good job breaking down why Notice was so heavy. If you're just a book lover in general, if you haven't found his channel, I would highly recommend subscribing to it anyway, because there's lots of good information in there. Anyway, Notice follows the main character, Nina, who is a teenage prostitute who starts working the parking lot near the home of her absent parents. One night, some guy picks her up while she's out working and brings her home. All kind of things happen with this guy's wife, who's actually there, all three of them. It's very graphic, and somehow she finds herself living there at their home, and you follow her through this haze of drugs, abuse, confusion. And I say confusion because the timeline here is really blurred. And I think that plays into the heaviness, that she doesn't know really how long she's been at this house. She just knows that all of a sudden she's got to leave, and she's eventually arrested and admitted into a psychiatric facility where she develops a sexual relationship with the counselor, who is also married and also female. And you follow her through that as she leaves this facility, and she's really just trying to navigate life. And does she go back to work as a prostitute? Or does she try to take on this regular job that was set up for her, and she's trying to survive former abusers? And it's this weird dynamic of not wanting to be in a situation, but intentionally putting yourself in that situation. And it's hard to read in so many places. And I agree with Oliver when he said that one of the reasons this becomes so disturbing is it's the raw nature of it. It's written in a manner where you can connect with a character on so many levels, unlike Cows. Cows is not at all of a believable story. It's sci-fi horror. Notice is not an entirely true story, and it's also not entirely fiction either. I've found accounts from Lewis where elements of Notice are actually pulled from her own life. There is a scene towards the end of that book that I think it's one of the most difficult things that I have ever read in my life. And I can't even begin to read passages from it for that reason. It's just a level of detail and graphicness and disturbed situation scene. You know, I'm going to fumble over how to word it. It's horrendous. And speaking of reading passages from the book, sometimes when I put these episodes together, I like to read some quotes or things to kind of give you an idea of the vibe of the book. But I read a review about Notice where it said the writing was terrible. And I couldn't disagree with that more. And I think no matter what reviews you read, you're going to find somebody in there that just hated the thing, no matter what it is. There are fragments of sentences used in Notice, and they're used a lot, and I could see how that might throw somebody off. But what I think it does is it allows you to dive further into the mind of the narrator. You feel her confusion, the slipping timeline, this desire for love and security, wanting to feel normal, but not knowing how to go about it, feeling worthy, feeling unworthy. You're just inside of her head the entire time. I honestly believe that was because of how it was written, and I think that was very much intentional. So Notice is tragic for umpteen number of reasons. Heather Lewis was said to be abused when she was a child, and she also battled depression. And knowing all of that, it makes this novel pack even more of an emotional punch, especially when you learn that some of these characters were pulled from people that she actually encountered in real life. When I was reading more about kind of the backstory behind this, apparently this book was rejected by everybody who read it. Like, nobody wanted to publish it at all. Heather Lewis, unfortunately, ended up taking her own life in 2002. This novel, Notice, was published actually 2 years after her death. So if you listen to any of these episodes, you'll see that a couple episodes ago, My Dark Vanessa, that was probably the darkest book that I've ever read, but I think it depends on who you are and what your reading style is. If you were to ask me what the most dark and disturbing book I've ever read, you might get Cows. You might get My Dark Vanessa, or you might get Notice. I'd have to feel out the conversation, I guess, and what I thought you might be looking for or even ready to read. Books like Notice and My Dark Vanessa and Cows, those are not for everybody. I don't think it's light reading, and I don't suggest those lightly to people. Suggesting something like Cows right out of the gate, that's not for somebody who reads a couple books a year. If you love Colleen Hoover and you love Frida McFadden, and somebody says, oh, you should check out Cows, that thing is going to rock your world. Cows is also not for people who read 100 books a year, so it all depends. Notice is one of those books that I think, for me personally, is by far the most dark and disturbing book that I have read to date. It has the graphic details. It's something that you feel could happen in real life. It's emotionally heavy. Every single component that I judge dark and disturbing books by, this one has it. So after all of this talk about dark and disturbing books, maybe the next episode will have to be, something relating to comedy. All I know is I'm tired and I really want to nap.
I hope the Xanax lasted you through all of that nonsense. Since you are still here, it would give my undies a tingle if you drop a 5-star review. Follow Have You Read This Podcast on Instagram, or I will beat you to death with my walker. Now get me out of here and get me my back pills.